right, why don't we go ahead and kick things off. So given the amount of development work happening in the Beanstalk ecosystem at the moment, we started setting up these calls to serve as a sort of discussion forum for all the various developments happening in the ecosystem. And, you know, previously have spent a bunch of time talking about things like Wells, why we're working on it, what it is. In particular today, I think it would be nice to have some folks actually building projects on top of Beanstalk talk a little bit about what they're working on, both conceptually and at a more technical level, to sort of get into the weeds of how the infrastructure that Beanstalk Farms is building can support all these various projects. So maybe Mod, if you're at a mic and around, it'd be great to maybe kick things off with you sharing a little bit about what you're working on with Modulend.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone, and we can get started. I can get started, I guess, just given that what we're working on is still brief or still relatively early. And then, we can talk as much as we want about it, and then maybe move to root. Okay, so Modulend. What we're working on is a lending protocol or a lending market, and the name comes from module and then lend. And what module is that we are building a modular, let's say, lending market or a lending protocol. Before we go into there and maybe see how does this fit into the whole Beanstalk ecosystem, we can quickly just go over the problem that we're trying to solve. And 1 second, sorry. All right, so what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Every lending market consists of 3 things. So you have the lender, and that is the person that has the assets that they want to lend out. And then you have the borrower, who's the person who is borrowing, such asset or said asset. And then lastly, what are the terms that are, between those two parties, the lender and the borrower? And this exists, so any loan basically has these things, and it is what we have, in TradFi or in DeFi as well. So we can talk about what are the limitations that we are experiencing or that we see in today's, let's say, lending markets. And I'll go through them quickly. And it doesn't mean that all protocols, don't address these things. But we think that, or we see that none of them does that, or all of them have some sort of limitation at one point or at one turn. So the most obvious would be what are the terms that we're lending out or what a loan is issued out at. Typically today at any lending protocol that you go in, so let's talk about maybe Aave, Compound, etc. There will be some sort of a determined formula at which the protocol agreed on that this is how we're going to calculate interest rate, and then set alone any other fees if that are involved. And then you as a borrower, you can go there and just choose to follow or join into these terms. Other things as well are the assets. So maybe the asset that you have is not accepted. Some protocols do address this, such as Euler. And then permissionless borrowing. Can I just come in and borrow permissionlessly? Almost all protocols do this, but you will have some exceptions. Under collateralized loans, can I take an under collateralized loan and not over collateralized loan? And then lastly, what can I do with this loan? So once that I've taken that loan, what are the things that I can do with it? Modulend aims to solve these problems, again, using a modular architecture or a modular system, and that will be divided into 3 things. So the first module will be the savers, and that's, again, the lenders, those who have the assets that they want to lend out. The second module would be the terms. What are these terms that the loan is being issued at? And then lastly, what we're calling as a terminal is basically, once you have taken the loan, what can you do with that loan? So far, is this clear?
Following on this end.
Okay, great. All right. And once you have those three, let's say, components or three different modules, we believe that you can build any sort of lending market or a lending protocol. So whatever it is that you can imagine it or think of it, irrespective of what are the terms are in, whatever oracle that you want to use, whatever asset that you want to use, and then finally, what exactly are you going to do with that loan? All of these things can be, building blocks that you just put in together, and you can create any market as you want to, as you see, or as borrowers see fit, permissionlessly. Okay, so how does this now fit in, to the Beanstalk ecosystem, or what is it that we are doing here? So there are a few things that I'll touch upon here. Initially, in what we're building as we start off, we intend on seeding, a lending pool for Root. Like, once again, all of this is very early on, but this is what our intentions are, or what our plans are. So we think, having deploying lending pools for Root is a missed opportunity. So there will be, first of all, there are roots that could be minted or created, and then you just lend them out or put them out for lending. So that's one thing. The other thing is also the tech that we're building could potentially be used, by Beanstalk in the future if Beanstalk wants to issue out, loans directly. And we have spoken about that, in multiple ways. And I guess this is a different discussion if that is to be wanted or not. And then lastly, maybe the most specific question on, where are we doing, or how do we foresee using wells in this? Is that, what kind of loans can we give out using wells or utilizing wells? And we see this as something that will happen and mature, as will the developments on wells progress. So why wells, and how can wells be used in lending protocols, or in lending in general? So one neat feature that we think wells will introduce is provable liquidity. And why is that important? Again, because at the end of the day, whenever you take out loans, the most important things for you to be able to get out of that loan is, to ensure that you can liquidate it. And then there are two things that can come with that provable liquidity. The provable liquidity one is that not only can you ensure that you can liquidate, maybe you can even ensure that you can liquidate at a certain loss. The other important part is as well maximizing the let's say utilization of the collateral that you have. So instead of me having let's say $100 worth of ETH, and then I can borrow at, I don't know, 60-70% of it. If I can ensure that I can, and usually that buffer is given there to ensure that you're able to liquidate. If you have provable liquidity, and then the wells architecture, or the wells system will ensure that this $100 is liquidated at $100, then you can take out, in theory, a loan that is worth 100% of that. So two things what provable liquidity again will do. First of all, is to ensure that you are able to liquidate. So you reduce the percentage or the possibility of a bad debt. And then the other part that will come in is maximizing the efficiency of what utilized, or what you can utilize. This is one thing that Publius addressed in their article, where they called it as or they described it with the stop loss orders. So having something like that is where you expect you'll be able to utilize that collateral at a 100% efficiency. I think more or less that's it from our end on what we're working on. Once again, this is still very early on. Things may change, but more or less the intention and the idea is as described. And I can pause here and take any questions.
So maybe just to summarize, and correct me if I'm wrong, this mod, Modulend will facilitate the lending and borrowing of any asset under basically any terms that can be composed together, and then used according to the rules of the loan. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the way that you're building this is maximally composable, so that all of the pieces can be developed independently and then composed together in basically totally customizable fashion.
Correct. This is the intention. So each one would be, you can think of it as a Lego brick, or as a building block, and hopefully we imagine at least that things will be reused and reused in multiple ways to create different permutations and combinations of lending markets.
Very cool. is the expectation to have over-collateralized lending, under-collateralized lending? I know that under-collateralized lending is something you've spoken a lot about in the past.
Yes, so both, but in our V1, we're aiming to focus on under-collateralized lending, and hopefully over-collateralized will come out later. We think there is a missed opportunity, generally speaking, in under-collateralized lending, and we can give an example on how that could be. So we can, for example, have a market at which you can borrow whatever asset. Let's say you come in with 100 USDC, you take a loan of 1,000 USDC, so now your loan is under-collateralized. And then after you've taken that loan at whatever terms it is, you can then swap it for beans and deposit it into the silo. So this is another collateralized loan. And what did you do with that loan? You invested, or you deposited, or you opened a position within Beanstalk. Does that make sense?
Just to confirm, the problem to date with the under collateralized loans is that in theory the borrower just can run off with the money and you take the collateral and now they've lost money. But in this case, the fact that the acceptable uses of the collateral are defined by the contract itself, and then in theory the collateral and the loan remain custodied by the protocol in some way such that people can't run off with the money, that you can facilitate under collateralized loans?
Correct. You have an example. So Gearbox, maybe some of you are aware of it, does that, which in that case, you take an under collateralized loan and then you would do certain things that they allow you to do with it. So it's similar in that case, with the exception that Gearbox is highly permissioned to an extent. So what are the things that you can do, and what are the assets that you can borrow, and again, what are the terms that are there, are all predefined. What the way or the architecture that we're aiming to build is that anyone can basically build any use case, and then as long as the lender is happy that their assets will be used for in that terminal or in that use case, so be it. You can go for it, and you don't need anyone's permission.
Hey Man, I have a question.
Hey Manifold.
What's up, brother? So this is very cool. So is the leverage something that's customizable per loan or per contract? Like is there a maximum leverage? Is that up to the loan issuer? How does that work?
Yeah. So the way that we're designing it is that you'll have a lender, and that lender could be anyone, right, with any asset that they have. They would go on, to Modulend, and then you'll be like, okay, here is my ETH, for example, and these are the things that I approve you, to do with my ETH. So what are these things, or what does that mean? Is basically, first of all, what are the terms? So I'm going to throw in a few examples. Maybe you're happy to give out 1 month loan for a one-time fee, for 0 interest, and some profit share. And then what are the things that you can do with it? You can use it to provide liquidity on Curve, or you can use it and use it within Beanstalk, or you can use it whatever, any other protocol that you can think of. So the lender is happy with these things. They'd be like, okay, these are the things that I approve, and these are the terms that I'm okay with. And then if there is a borrower that wants to come in and take out a loan with these conditions, they're happy to do so. Everything is under the custody of Modulend. So the borrower doesn't take that capital and do something else with it. Everything that they do is still under the custody of Modulend, but under the terms that are approved by the lender. Did this answer your question, Manifold?
Yeah, I think so. So it seems like it's totally customizable by the lender, and I'm making the assumption, and tell me if this is wrong, that the lender kind of also specifies if what level margin is insufficient or liquidated?
Correct. So they will also put in what is the collateralization ratio that they're happy with. So add in what's the liquidator reward that they would want to give out to someone who, when that loan or position is open for liquidation, then the person who clicks that button, what kind of reward they get. A lot of this could be seen as well in Rari. So Rari, let's say, does the first half of it. So in the way that you're able to permissionlessly deploy, a lending pool at any terms that you want. So most of this, or some of this, could be pictured or thought of as on what Rari, enabled or did. There were, again, some limitations on the Rari side. There are some other things that we can talk about, which is, you as a lender, you can then not only choose one thing at which your capital can be used or borrowed against. It can be a range of things. We don't expect to launch with that, but that will be something that will come out later. So in theory, let's think that people can create a lending market that is exactly the copy of Aave, right? It follows all the rules of Aave. And then another one, which is all the rules, again, of Compound, and so on. List all of those different protocols. In theory, as a lender, you can come in and be like, I'm happy with all of these terms. So it is almost equivalent to you being, your capital is accessible to all of these different markets. And again, depending on which market comes and utilizes, or which borrower comes and takes at which terms, then your capital can be utilized. But these are now details of details.
Very cool and exciting. Imagine the UI for this is critical, given the customization available. But that's very cool, Mod.
Thank you. Once again, all of this is still in like early stages. The V1 that we're building, we expect it to be very, very minimalistic, I say, or simple in what it can do. What we're focused on is, again, for anyone to be able to deploy any terms. So this is crucial to what you can do, or what you can lend out at. And then once you take out a loan, what you can do with, we're limiting it to as simple, let's say, derivatives market. So you can long and short assets. You can't do things like deposit into the Beanstalk silo for now. But you'll be able to long and short assets in general. So a derivatives market is probably one of the first things that we want to have a use case for that lending market. And then later on, we want to build those other terminals, and definitely Beanstalk is one of them. Mr. Mochi asks, what happens to the voting rights of the root tokens that are borrowed? I didn't give a thought about it, and maybe I'm not also, I don't have a lot of I'm not sure if I totally understand exactly how currently root governance works. But generally speaking, any loans or under-collateralized loans, of course, there would be over-collateralized loans at a later end, but all under-collateralized loans will be held or still held by the Modulend contract. So we can think later, what does that mean? But you'd want to think of it in the same way as any other asset, basically, that you've lent out. And I think it is fair to assume that you lose your voting rights with it.
So this is a more basic question coming from someone who's not a heavy user of, or looked very deeply into some of these lending protocols. But can you help answer the question of why some of this functionality doesn't already exist? So more specifically, in the case of Aave or Compound, what's the limitation or rationale that led to having permissioned whitelists of what assets you can and can't borrow and lend?
There are different reasons, and I can speculate on some or guess some, but obviously won't be able to tell exactly why everyone does something as such. My understanding, generally speaking, on whitelisting assets, it always has to do with risk. So you don't want to use some collateral that you don't really know what is the risk of, if you're able to liquidate it or not. And then you want to just remove that. So you can, as they call them, as shitcoins or so on. So whitelisting assets that you want to use is for that reason, for risk. You have other protocols that have worked around that. So we go back again to the examples of Rari, also Euler. They allow you to use any asset basically. So they've worked around the risk around it, or how can you separate or mitigate the risk with it. Why is under-collateralized lending not popular, let's say, or wide open? Again, it will also come with the risk of what are you doing with that capital. In theory, all of them can do that, but it may be that their markets are too big that they aren't focused on let's say the smaller, or for now at least, the things that are smaller to them. So when you have $1 billion of USDC, let's say, it is not so much attractive if someone comes with 5 million of some asset that may be too risky for you. Does that make sense, Guy, and answer this question?
Yeah, it does. I follow. Appreciate it. I guess on the under-collateralization front, are there any projects that have done anything resembling that in the past?
Under collateralized loan?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you have Gearbox. You can check out Gearbox.
Got it. Thanks.
Of course. So the idea, or the core idea, again, is that you can build any sort of lending market that you can think of. And one way to think of it is, because we spoke a little bit about the UI, and the UI may combine all of these things together, but we can also think of cases where someone wants to launch their own brand of a lending protocol that has its own feature, and then it just uses the same tag behind it. Because at the end of the day, all you need are those three different bricks, and you combine them, and you've made your own or the three different modules, and you've created your own lending market. This idea initially developed through stages. There were stages as it went through. At the very, very beginning, and I think we shared this, some of you know this already, I've gone through it, which was, greenhouse. And the idea of us, or the problem then that we were solving, is how can we long or short, just the price of bean. And, then we wanted to do that with zero fees and zero interest rate. So we thought of the profit share model. So, you can take out a loan at zero interest and, zero fees, and then, it will be a profit share with between the lender and the borrower. We then wanted to add that to different asset classes, and then finally we thought on how can we generalize this so that it can be any terms, any borrower, any use case. So one thing, for example, is that you can think of that maybe someone would want to start a lending protocol, and their line or their feature again is that zero fees, zero interest, and it's only a profit share. And you can call that any name, and it can have its own UI and its own front end and its own branding. But at the end of the day, it uses the same tech in the back end, if that makes sense. So again, it doesn't really matter, what is it exactly, as long as that whatever it is, whatever market that you can think of, you will be able to deploy it permissionlessly.
Thanks for running through that, Mod. Maybe we can give it another moment or two to see if folks have questions.
Yeah, and we can also stop here and discuss other things, and if folks want to come back to the same topic, I'm happy to.
Well, if nothing else for now, and we can always come back to it. Maybe Mr. Manifold, it'd be great if you could talk about what's going on in your world at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. So I can start with the root token, the new root token that is in audit currently with Halborn, and kind of just go over some of the key changes there that we decided it would be best to implement for a few reasons. Some of the most important being scalability of the token, such that minting scales. And there isn't, prohibitive slippage, which is something that we started observing fairly quickly with the current variation of the root token, and a handful of other things. So some of the key upgrades or changes are ability to accept multiple deposit types within the silo, and storing deposits as a linked list from newest season to oldest. Creating, or each whitelisted token will also have a max exposure percent for each deposit type. So if the root DAO whitelists Bean3 curve, for instance, and that's the first deposit type that's accepted in the contract, but later on Wells launch and the root DAO wants to have exposure to the Bean ETH pool, for instance, being able to vote on whitelisting that asset type, as well as cementing a max exposure percent for that deposit type. And one of the key changes on minting is that the root contract will be minting based off of BDV instead of BDV stock and seeds, such that if as the root token ages and there's more stock in the contract, that's not prohibitive to new minters, because again, it's off of BDV, which we think is very important to help scale the token. And then on the redemption side, the first priority on redemptions is to redeem deposit types that exceed the max exposure percent, until the contract reaches the max exposure percent across all deposit types. And then the second priority in that waterfall is to redeem deposits with the least stock per VDV across any deposit type. And so this is currently in audit with Halborn. We're hoping that they'll be able to wrap up the audit in the next few weeks. And then the plan is most likely for the Root DAO to propose an upgrade to the current contract, and which will include updated documentation and more specifics about the token. And then as the Beanstalk ecosystem starts growing and Root markets start getting launched hopefully in the next few months, this is the token that is predominantly involved in market making activities and providing liquidity to those markets. And I think that was probably a good segue as well for Icarus to discuss more on the market side.
Yeah. Hey, everybody.
Maybe before we go into the markets, just if people have questions on the Root token first, because I think the markets are going to be quite in depth, similar to what Mod was talking about. So it might just be good to pause and see if people have questions on the Root token you just described. And I do have one to kick us off, perhaps. So the idea behind changing the minting to BDV exclusively instead of stock and seeds, you mentioned that had to do with scaling the token. Presumably, this is what you were talking about at the beginning around the cost to minting being too high in practice over time. Is that right?
Spot on. Yep.
And so the concept is now by switching to BDV only, there's way less friction at the minting phase, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then just to confirm, so on the redemption side, you're now redeeming based on exposure that the DAO sets first, and then within that, then you're giving whoever redeems Roots the deposits with the least stock per BDV.
Exactly.
So this in practice, the instead of the cost happening on the entry, because in the current Root token, everyone when they redeem, they can choose their deposits effectively such that there's no cost to redeem, but there is a cost to mint. The new Root token is switching that so that there's no cost to mint, but there is a cost to redeem.
Exactly. And one of the mental models that I think might be helpful to think about, if this is kind of your first time hearing about this, is I almost think it creates a silo-like effect on redemption, such that if you do opt to redeem, which is fine, a redeemer is going to receive pro rata BDV, but there is going to be some stock forfeiture.
All right, this makes sense. Sorry for hawking the mic. Other people.
No worries. Then next up is...
Well, Icarus, let's just wait until see if anyone has more questions on the Root token. I actually have more questions on the Root token, but want to just open up the mic briefly to see if other people do as well. But promise, I appreciate how excited you are to present, and promise we'll give you the floor very shortly.
Definitely. So I had a follow-up question on that front. Is it fair to say then that the incentive for someone who wants to acquire Roots via minting would be to mint Roots with with deposits that have been in the silo for the least amount of time, rather than the opposite?
Yeah, it would incentivize. It certainly caters towards newer deposits. Exactly right, Guy.
And is that not true with the existing implementation, or what exactly is the incentive currently?
Yeah, with the existing implementation, the contract is basically taking into account BDV stock and seeds, and taking the most efficient deposit in. So right now, if you go to roottoken.org and you have a new deposit, I haven't checked in a few days, but I believe the minting is something pretty substantial, or the slippage, I'm sorry, is pretty substantial. like 20% slippage or something like that. And that's, again, because there's more stock in the contract than a newer deposit. Stock per BDV, I should say.
Got it. So in the new implementation, one should not deposit and immediately redeem. Basically, you'd be getting like the short end of the stick on with regards to like what deposits you end up getting for your redemption.
In theory, yes, unless, maybe you're a speculator or, you don't necessarily care. But, I would think any like Beanstalk educated user probably does care about that. Yeah.
Right. Makes sense. Thanks.
Of course.
Manifold, sorry, I may be asking the same question, but just want to clarify my understanding. So to an extent, this will remove any friction from newer deposits, given that now you're minting root based on per BDV. But this adds a little bit of friction, let's say, to existing deposits. So let's say I'm an older deposit with a lot of grown stock, and then I want to mint root for it. Then I lose that stock. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, it's definitely not optimized for, I would say existing, silo deposits or older silo deposits. There's kind of trade-offs you have to make in any variation of the root token with the way Beanstalk works. And we felt that it was best to optimize for growth and newer deposits.
Yeah, I see the challenge and understand the rationale.
So when you talk about roots or the underlying deposits of roots having like a maximum exposure to some particular deposit type, I take that to mean that you wouldn't be able to mint roots with a particular deposit on the root whitelist under certain conditions. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so it can't exceed like the max exposure percent that the DAO sets. So, if the to use an example, if the DAO sets exposure type to 50% Bean3 curve and 50% Bean ETH, then the deposit type used plus underlying deposit amount can't exceed that max exposure percent of total underlying BDD in the contract.
Makes sense. So I can imagine like a UI far into the future where, users that don't care about I guess if you're just trying to acquire roots in a single transaction with something like some other stablecoin, I guess it doesn't matter to the user what deposit they're minting roots with, and thus, you could end up buying and depositing the deposit type that's farthest from its desired exposure ratio, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So to the user that's minting, whether you're minting with USDC, ETH, a Bean deposit, whatever, it's not going to really make a difference to that user what they end up minting with, like what that mint basically converts into.
Makes sense.
Wait, so does that mean that if you have some sort of efficient minting scheme at the UI level, that even if the user wants to add USDC and the contract has too much USDC, that then you'll swap the USDC to an asset that the contract would prefer to have?
Yeah, so I think that the contract, my understanding of the contract is that it will mint based off of what the contract prefers to have. So it's the user can't elect arbitrarily what to mint with.
At the contract level or the UI level?
At the contract level.
If there's above a certain maximum, you mean above the threshold?
Yeah, exactly. So if Bean ETH is above the threshold.
I guess what I'm asking is, assuming that things are below the threshold, or maybe they're at the threshold, but the point is, even when they're below the threshold, the UI can make it such that the optimal asset from the contract perspective is added, assuming that there's no difference to the user in terms of the routes that they'd be credited.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of similar to the current UI where, if you go to Mint, it's the UI is basically it's either swapping from the LP or it's minting from the contract directly, whatever is the most efficient route to mint for the user or acquire routes for the user.
Very cool. Think that I would have to look more into the way that the contract incentivizes adding the efficient asset, but assuming that there's no cost to the user, that's very cool. On the governance front, how do you expect the root DAO to set the thresholds around what the contract should have in terms of exposure?
So my expectation is that if root front runs, if the new root token and is approved by the DAO and upgraded, and if it front runs well, then obviously the exposure will be just 100% Bean3 curve, which is today. But given the interest in the Beanstalk community to have a Bean ETH well, I wouldn't be surprised if there is interest in whitelisting Bean ETH as well as the second whitelisted asset type. In terms of exposure, I really don't know. I guess we'll kind of see. I would imagine it's more compelling to whitelist, ETH at $1,000 than $10,000, but time will tell. We'll see what happens.
This may or may not have been what Publius was getting at, but I guess the question it made me think of is, do you expect it to be like the ratios to be like hard coded in a proposal to some extent, like in the near term? Of like of like what the ratio would be between Bean3 curve and a Bean ETH well, for example.
That's something I haven't put too much thought in, admittedly, in the near term. I'm mostly running under the assumption that Bean3 curve will probably be the first, and then there'll be another proposal after that, depending on when wells launch. So I don't really know the cadence there, but if that's something that's happening in the next month, then that probably changes the proposal that the DAO would put out at launch of the new token.
When you say the DAO would put out, do you mean like Root would put out to the DAO, or the DAO would put out to the Beanstalk community?
Like the Root DAO would vote on like the exposure. I don't believe the Beanstalk community would be involved in that vote directly, unless I'm misunderstanding how governance works.
Got it. Just didn't understand the language there. That makes sense.
And governance, is something that's super tricky. Like, it's really something that we're still actively thinking through. I think we faced a lot of the same challenges, we as in the Root DAO, that the Beanstalk community is facing. And, I think in general, Root is actively deferring to Beanstalk in its approach to governance rather than try to be the pioneer on the governance front. It takes a ton of resources, as you can see from these budget proposals, et cetera, and considering how governance can work best. So, we might certainly have ideas, but ultimately, kind of defer to Beanstalk's model. I think our understanding right now is as Beanstalk's governance innovates, so will Root's.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I could imagine a future gauge system for what you're describing, where root holders can, elect in real time their desired exposure ratio to each of the deposit types. Similar to how hopefully one day that stockholders can elect in real time, the seeds per BDV rewards for each deposit.
Totally. And this was actually like a gauge-like system was actually, the first kind of idea that was being floated with this new token, because there had to be, there has to be exposures set. But ultimately, that also comes with a heap of complexity, which I'm sure you can appreciate, Guy. And so, we kind of deferred on that for now.
Awesome. Well, go ahead, Publius. Do you have something to say?
No, was just gonna say, yeah. Finally, sorry for holding you back, Icarus, but feel free to talk about what you've been up to.
No worries. Yeah, what I've been up to is building the generalized root markets, which are basically betting markets settled in root token. A quick rundown on what this is. It consists of two things, like called the root factory and the token factory, which basically allows everybody to create a betting market on top of any oracle, as long as there's a translation towards the towards the token factory for that oracle. That basically means that everybody can create a pari-mutuel market on an if or on an if statement, essentially. Can mint position tokens based on a decision that's on chain or from an oracle, and have any arbitrary payout or settlement from an oracle. So we could build position tokens that get payout based on spread, handicap betting, or any arbitrary scoring logic, which basically helps building the generalized market, so we can just bet on everything with root. Yeah, the whole thing is currently in audit with Hellborn, and I hope we can launch this in the near future.
So can you talk a little bit more about the architecture of the system? You said there are two parts to it.
Yeah. Okay. They're basically the root factory, which is what creates the event and the token factory. The token factory mints the position tokens, the tokens that represent the position of the user in a pari-mutuel market, and any other position. And the root factory basically prepares the oracle to be consumed by the token factory, so that we can have any arbitrary oracle be used in the token factory for any match or any event.
So could you bet on through this system? Could you deploy contracts that facilitate betting on the price of Ethereum, for example, or the price of Ether? Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. We will basically deploy an oracle contract that gives us, let's say, you want to build a call option on this. Basically gives us a value back for the pari-mutuel market, so people can bet on if the value of the price of ETH is above $2,000 or below $2,000, and the pari-mutuel market will then settle on that contract.
And then this would also work for, in theory, any data that can be reported by an oracle. So not just the price of an asset, but the yield in the silo, or
Correct.
the outcome of a sports game or something like that.
Yeah, correct. What's sort of special about that is that the root factory accepts every kind of address as an oracle, as long as there's a proper translation towards the token factory, so that the token factory can read the state of the market or the event.
And is it possible to create multiple different types of bets or markets based on the same oracle? So taking the price of Ether and then creating calls or puts or futures with different parameters from the same oracle? How would that work?
Yeah, you would basically create a different transition payout function that translates the oracle data into how the payout for the user ends up. to be. You could reuse oracles as often as you want.
And are positions minted as tokens?
Yeah, they are minted as 1155 tokens, ERC 1155. So they are tradable and stackable as you want. Oh, speaking of minting positions, we also have a fee, which basically when you enter a position, there is a fee that occurs, and that fee is spread across all markets. So you have like it incentivizes early liquidity. So when you deposit into like a pari-mutuel market, you earn from the people that come after you, which essentially helps with deepening liquidity.
And is that fee mandatory for all pools? Are you talking
No.
about the accounting for the fee happens across all of the pools?
Okay, yeah. When a user creates a new event, basically, he can select if that event should have a fee or not. And if that fee is enabled, it occurs across all pools. Let's say we have an event based on the ETH price and one on the Bean price. And if you participate in both events, you don't need to claim twice. You can claim once and get the fees that occurred for both events.
So if the market has a fee, then the fees can all be claimed at once, is really what you're talking about.
Yeah, correct.
And the positions are always represented as 1155s. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, they are always represented as 1155. So when we create the token factory, when the user creates the token factory by creating a new event, it basically creates a position token, which has IDs. Well, we use the 1155 to not deploy for every position a new token, just use one. And the ERC 1155 then has IDs depending on the position the token is for.
And does this only support pari-mutuel pools, or does this support like P2P betting? That's just there's two sides of the bet, and I want to take one side of the bet, and I can lock in my odds at the time, or this is only pari-mutuel?
It supports both. We have a mode. I will call it mode. One that's basically minting only one side when you enter a position, and one that allows minting of all sides. So we can have market makers on top that might want to mint the position, but sell their, let's say, A token because they think A is very unlikely to happen. So yeah, you can create all kinds of markets, not just pari-mutuel, also just positional markets.
So there's a little bit of noise by me, and I'm sorry about that, but I just want to understand. So there's the pari-mutuel mode, which the payout of the whatever's being bet on is a function of how many tokens are bet on each side, right? But then you're saying that there's also a mode that is non-pari-mutuel, where the odds that you receive from a given position are dependent on the price that you get when you buy the position. Is that right?
Yeah. The other mode is basically when user enters a position, he gets tokens that represent every side of that, and then he's free to sell one of that token on an AMM because he thinks that side or that result is unlikely to happen, or he can redeem all of these tokens back and get his initial.
So, and does this only work for two-sided markets, or how many? Like, if there's a sports match with a draw, can you do three-sided markets?
Yeah, on the contract level, we support any sites markets. Like, obviously, gas is a restraint, but from the logic, you can create 10-sided markets, and it works as well.
In which case, you'd mint, if it was parimutuel, you'd only mint whatever tokens represent the sides that you're betting on. But if it's this other version, then you'd mint all 10 tokens and then have to sell whichever positions that you wanted.
Yep. And when you want to redeem, you basically need the same amount of all 10 tokens to get your initial, or the share of the initial back.
So if you are market making, for example, and you're buying and selling both sides of the market, you can then redeem both sides. If you have a two-sided market, you can then redeem tokens that represent both sides of the market for what? For the collateral that you initially posted to mint the tokens?
Correct, for the root in this case.
And do the contracts only support roots, or they support any ERC20 tokens?
They support any ERC20 token.
And only ERC20s, or also 1155s and 721s?
Essentially, they would also support only ERC20s for the minting.
Got it. So you when you create the market, you presumably specify the token that you use to mint?
Correct. When the user wants to create a new market on top of any oracle, they have to specify what type of token it gets settled in.
And do you settle in one token or more than one token?
It's one token, one ERC20.
So you in all cases, you're now choosing a settlement token. You're choosing some oracle that will settle the market, presumably, right?
Yeah.
You called it a payout function to process the oracle data,
Correct.
and then some settlement function that distributes the money to the different tokens based on the results of the payout function.
Correct. The special thing is with the settlement function, we can also plug in other components of the ecosystem, like liquidate on settlement, for example.
And how would that work?
We would write a custom settlement function for that, and the user can select, like, if he wants to liquidate a position when the oracle settled, or the underlying when the market settled.
And when you're deploying a market, you're then composing each of these four pieces together to create a market?
Yep. The user has, obviously that needs to happen on the UI side, but the user passes in what payout function, what settlement function, and what oracle to use. And then based on that, the market is created.
Very cool. This makes a lot of sense. If other people have questions, happy to yield the mic a little bit.
Not sure if this is a question for Icarus or Manifold, but was curious if you guys had ideas on what particular types of markets that you guys intend to launch, or if maybe that's the wrong question and any interface that's built on top of this stuff would allow anyone to set up any type of market as well.
Yep. Your Manifold, if you want.
Go ahead, I'll go after you.
Yeah, right now we have implementations for like the Chainlink oracles and Yuma oracles. So we support already a wide variety of sports, which we can create markets on. We plan to automate that, as far as I know.
Yeah,
Go
go ahead.
What type of market types do you envision? Like what type of payout functions or settlement functions have you guys thought of?
I personally think obviously parimutuel function, and just betting on a score. But besides that, which things I would like to see in the future are like handicap betting or betting on a spread between scores on like a football match.
Yeah, so I think like high level, and this is admittedly downstream of a lot of legal and regulatory aspects, but high level, in an ideal world, what you can facilitate is totals, spreads, money lines for kind of every major sporting event or every major sports league daily. And you can kind of implement what Icarus has just thoughtfully went over, but also have order book style betting, maybe like positional parimutuel markets, things of that nature. So you have these floating lines depending on volume, but then you also have fixed lines. But we're actively kind of figuring out from a regulatory perspective what is and what isn't possible. So that is, Guy, to answer your question, that is going to be a key component of what markets we end up launching with. But the tech is generalizable such that you could really launch with anything, but it's kind of downstream of that.
So just to confirm, if I'm a user and I bet on a let's say the Giants winning, well, I guess the Giants aren't playing this Sunday, unfortunately, but let's say I bet on the Eagles losing this Sunday, and then the odds move in my favor because Jalen Hurts gets hurt, God forbid, that then I would, in theory, assuming that there's liquidity in the market, be able to liquidate my position and cash out a profit even before the event happens.
Yeah, basically. Obviously, it depends what's more profitable, like selling the position or buying the other position token and then redeeming.
But in theory, the UI would abstract that.
Yeah. You can basically exit your position ahead of time.
Very cool. All right, Guy, do you know who's next?
I think that's it. No, I know that CMail mentioned perhaps it doesn't make sense, quite make sense yet to talk about irrigation, but if you've changed your mind, by all means, sir.
Yeah, not really changed our mind so much. I want to make sure we can do it at a point where SG is on the phone to kind of talk through some of the more technical stuff.
Sounds great. Well, we'll be doing these for a while. So anytime, just let us know.
So, thanks, we'll do.
So given that, maybe we'll ask Publius, do you think were there other things in particular you wanted to get to today, or what do you think? Discussion-wise?
I mean, maybe it would make sense to just leave the floor open to see if people have any comments generally on some of the developments that are happening. It might be helpful to just talk at a high level about, there's been a lot of discussion around utility for beans and what that will actually look like. And to some extent, these protocols that have been described, at least
Louis, I think
stuff
we lost you for 10 or 15 seconds.
Can you hear me now?
Protocols, something, utility for beans, like 20 seconds ago.
But can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now.
Well, there's there's been a lot of discussion on how and what utility for Beans will look like. Think that this is the both Root and Modulend present, and the stuff that they're currently working on and describing do present somewhat of a basic template of an answer to the question around utility. Now, think that substantively, it's important to acknowledge that a significant amount of this utility is still going to be utility to speculate on stuff. Now, to a large extent, this isn't the type of utility that we've been talking about in the grand scheme of things, which is utility for real economic activity, but would really highlight that because of the composable nature of what is being built, or being described at least as being built, should really provide the basis for real economic activity denominated in B. And so the ability to write custom loans is obviously a necessary part of that. And the ability to denominate certain bets or derivatives that are denominated in certain assets is also another part to creating a system where real economic activity can happen. And so this obviously isn't a complete answer to how do we get to a place where there's real economic activity happening in Beans. And if anything, it may point towards more open questions or more friction points where there's still a lot of work to be done to get to a place where there is the potential for real economic activity to be happening in Beans, or really any cryptocurrency for that matter. But both Modulend and Root and their work, in our opinion, are very, very important parts in moving to a place or creating an environment where real economic activity can happen in Beans. So maybe it's good to just open up the floor for a bit to see if people want to talk about or ask more questions about what's been described and how that can actually potentially facilitate economic activity in Beans. But this is, from our perspective, provides a lot more color for the group to now collectively discuss what it would even mean for Beans to be used, which is sort of where we left the discussion.
So Bacchus brought up a question about some of the governance discussions from last week. Feel like might be appropriate to punt that to class later today. And also, to the point around leaving the floor open, would just say that part of the reason why we have these in these voice channels rather than stages is so folks can unmute and talk easily. So would encourage folks to do so if they're able.
If no one has any questions, comments, thoughts, we can obviously end a bit early, but I feel like there's been a lot of stuff presented, so it's almost hard to believe that no one's got questions on their mind or things they wouldn't like better to be understood. And I think everyone that presented is still on the phone, so if people have questions, now is as good a time as ever to try to get some of them clarified. Going once? Going twice?
All right, well, please interrupt me if you object, but feel like we can call it there in that case.
See everybody in class.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.